Buckingham Palace has many locked doors, but there is one door inside Windsor Castle that even queens are not allowed to open. And in early 2026, Princess Anne made sure Camilla understood exactly why. The room the palace never talks about. Buckingham Palace is famous for its grand halls, glittering staterooms, and endless corridors lined with portraits of kings and queens. But there are places within the royal residences that almost no one ever sees. Rooms that do not appear on visitor maps, doors that remain closed even during the most elaborate tours, spaces that exist quietly, deliberately, far from public view. Inside Windsor Castle, beyond the ceremonial apartments and the familiar corridors used during state visits, there is one such place. A narrow stone passageway that ends at a single reinforced door. No brass plaque, no decorative markings, no indication of what lies behind it. Yet within royal circles, that room has carried a quiet reputation for decades. It is known simply as the Queen's private archive. For most of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, the existence of this archive was rarely discussed publicly. The royal archives themselves are well known, of course. Historians regularly consult them. Thousands of documents from centuries of monarchy are catalogued, preserved, and carefully studied by scholars around the world. But the Queen's private archive was something different entirely. It was not managed by historians. It was not accessible to researchers. And it was never intended for the public. The origins of the collection trace back to the early 1950s, shortly after Elizabeth ascended the throne. At that time, the young queen began keeping a separate set of personal records, letters, and reflections that she believed were too sensitive for ordinary archival storage. Over the years, that collection slowly expanded. Private correspondence with foreign leaders, handwritten reflections on major constitutional events, notes taken during confidential meetings with prime ministers, personal letters exchanged with family members during moments of crisis. Some of those documents were believed to contain the Queen's most candid observations about the monarchy itself, not the careful diplomatic language used in official communications, but the private thoughts of a woman who had spent her entire adult life carrying the weight of the crown. For decades, those papers accumulated quietly, a leather-bound notebook here, a sealed envelope there, boxes delivered to Windsor and stored away with little ceremony. The room itself gradually transformed into something far more significant than an ordinary archive. Climate-controlled cabinets were installed. Reinforced shelving units replaced older storage racks. Security protocols were quietly upgraded over time. By the 1980s, access to the room had already become tightly restricted. Only a handful of palace officials even knew it existed. By the time the new millennium arrived, the list of people permitted to enter had grown smaller still. Queen Elizabeth maintained personal oversight of the collection. When particularly sensitive materials arrived, she would sometimes review them herself before instructing palace archivists on where they should be stored. And as the years passed, the Queen grew increasingly protective of that memory, particularly during the later decades of her reign, when the royal family faced wave after wave of public controversy. The breakdown of Prince Charles and Princess Diana's marriage, the death of Diana in 1997, the endless scrutiny that followed, the controversies surrounding Prince Andrew, the departure of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle from royal duties. Each of those moments generated enormous private correspondence inside the palace. Letters exchanged between family members, memoranda circulated among senior advisors, personal notes written by the Queen herself as she tried to navigate storms that threatened the stability of the monarchy. Many of those documents never entered the official royal archives. Instead, they were placed in the room at Windsor. By the late 2010s, Queen Elizabeth had reportedly issued a final set of instructions regarding the archive's future. Those instructions were unusually specific. The room was to remain sealed from ordinary administrative control. The contents were not to be catalogued publicly. And most importantly, authority over the archive would not automatically pass to the next monarch. Instead, custodial oversight would be granted to a small number of individuals the Queen personally trusted, a place very few people ever visited. But the delicate balance surrounding that room began to shift in the months following the Queen's death. Because the moment Elizabeth was gone, questions began to emerge. Questions about who now controlled the monarchy's most sensitive private records. Questions about what exactly had been preserved inside that archive for 70 years. And most importantly, questions about who might eventually gain access to it. Those questions remained mostly confined to private conversations among royal staff until late autumn of 2025. That was when a request arrived at Windsor Castle that would quietly trigger one of the most unexpected confrontations inside the royal household in years. The request came from Queen Camilla, and what she was asking for was permission to enter the one room in Windsor Castle that Queen Elizabeth had spent decades protecting from almost everyone, including, as it would soon become clear, Camilla's request. The request arrived quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no palace briefing, and no official statement to the press. Instead, a single communication moved through the private administrative channels of Windsor Castle in late November of 2025. Within the royal household, the message carried unusual weight. Queen Camilla was asking for access to Queen Elizabeth II's private archive. At first glance, the request seemed reasonable. Camilla was now Queen Consort. She accompanied King Charles at official events and represented the monarchy across Britain and the Commonwealth. From a ceremonial perspective, few people would question her interest in reviewing historical records connected to the institution she now helped represent. But the room inside Windsor Castle was not an ordinary archive. It existed under a completely different set of rules. The request had been sent directly to the custodial office responsible for the late Queen's personal collection. That office, as palace staff knew very well, answered to only one member of the royal family, Princess Anne. The wording of the request was careful and diplomatic. According to aides familiar with the correspondence, Camilla's office explained that the Queen Consort hoped to review selected documents as part of a future historical preservation initiative. The idea was to explore whether certain materials could one day contribute to curated exhibitions about Elizabeth's reign, highlighting her leadership during the second half of the 20th century and the early years of the 21st. On paper, the proposal sounded respectful and responsible. Inside Windsor Castle, however, the reaction from senior staff was immediate and cautious. Everyone who had worked closely with Elizabeth understood something essential about the archive. It had never been created for public display. It had been created for privacy. Many of the documents stored inside the room were believed to contain personal reflections written during some of the most turbulent moments in modern royal history. The collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage in the 1990s, the national grief following Diana's death in 1997, the constitutional tensions surrounding the monarchy during the early 2010s. Later events added even more sensitivity. Private internal discussions following the Duke and Duchess of Sussex stepping back from royal duties in 2020 were believed to be preserved there. So too were internal reflections connected to the scandal surrounding Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein. Some of these records reportedly included Elizabeth's own handwritten impressions of how the monarchy should respond to crises that threatened its reputation. They were never intended for public consumption. They were the private thoughts of a sovereign who understood that history often looks very different from the inside than it does from the outside. For decades, Elizabeth had been meticulous about separating those reflections from the official record. Documents meant for historians were sent to the royal archives. Documents meant only for memory were sent to Windsor. That meant the room Princess Anne now oversaw contained something extremely rare. Not just documents, but context. When Elizabeth drafted her final archival directive in the late 2010s, she made one principle unmistakably clear. The private archive was not to become an extension of royal public relations. Its purpose was preservation, not interpretation. Anyone seeking access would therefore need to prove that their request aligned with the Queen's original intent. Since Elizabeth's death in September of 2022, almost no one had attempted to make that request, until now. Within hours of receiving the message, Anne's office began reviewing the details. The language, the scope, and the justification were examined carefully. Palace aides quietly debated what Camilla might hope to find. Was she interested in documents about Charles's path to the throne, or reflections about the monarchy's recent challenges? There was also a more delicate possibility. If the archive contained what many believed it did, there was a chance that Elizabeth had written about Camilla herself. Some of those reflections might date back to the decades when Camilla's relationship with Charles existed under intense public scrutiny. No one outside a very small circle knew exactly what Elizabeth had written during those years. For nearly 2 weeks, Anne did not reply. Then, in early December of 2025, a brief message was sent from her office. The acknowledgement was polite and measured. Princess Anne confirmed that the request had been received and that it would be reviewed according to the archival directives established by Queen Elizabeth II. No approval was granted, no denial was issued, only time. But waiting, it seemed, was not part of Camilla's plan, because by the first weeks of January in 2026, the question of access would move beyond letters entirely. The matter would unfold face-to-face in a narrow stone corridor at Windsor Castle, right outside the door Elizabeth had protected for 70 years. And when that conversation finally happened, it would end with 4 words. Palace staff would repeat for months afterward. "You don't belong here." The door at Windsor. By the time January of 2026 arrived, the atmosphere inside Windsor Castle had become noticeably tense among the small circle of staff who understood what was unfolding. The request that Queen Camilla had submitted weeks earlier had not disappeared into administrative silence. It had simply reached the point where written correspondence was no longer enough. What had begun as a formal inquiry was about to become a face-to-face encounter. On a cold morning, during the second week of January, Camilla arrived at Windsor with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to moving freely through the royal residences. The Queen Consort had spent decades navigating the private spaces of the monarchy, and Windsor Castle was hardly unfamiliar territory. Yet this particular visit carried a different kind of significance. She was not there for a luncheon, a ceremony, or a routine engagement. She had come with the clear intention of resolving the question that had been left unanswered since November: access to the Queen's private archive. Camilla was accompanied by a small group that reflected the seriousness of her request. One senior palace aide walked beside her, carrying a slim folder that contained the earlier correspondence exchanged with Princess Anne's office. A historian affiliated with a Royal Heritage Initiative had also been invited to attend, lending the visit an air of academic legitimacy. The presence of that historian was meant to reinforce the explanation Camilla had offered in her request, that the purpose of viewing the archive was historical preservation rather than personal curiosity. But the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle have a way of stripping away appearances. To reach the archive room, visitors must leave behind the familiar ceremonial wings of the castle and pass through a series of narrower service passages rarely seen by the public. The walls in this part of the building are older, their stone surfaces worn smooth by centuries of quiet movement. The lighting is deliberately subdued, both to protect nearby collections and to preserve the calm, controlled atmosphere that has long characterized the castle's archival areas. At the end of one such passage stands the door. It is not especially ornate. In fact, its appearance is almost deliberately unremarkable. The reinforced oak panels are fitted with modern security mechanisms that were installed during the later years of Queen Elizabeth's reign. There is no plaque identifying what lies beyond it, no decorative emblem announcing its importance. Only those who have been told its purpose understand what the room contains. When Camilla reached the corridor that morning, she discovered something unexpected. Princess Anne was already there. Anne had arrived earlier, having been informed that the Queen Consort intended to visit the archive in person. She stood quietly near the end of the passageway, dressed in the practical style that had long become her trademark. There were no dramatic gestures, no visible display of confrontation. She simply waited beside the door, hands folded, her expression composed and unreadable. Those who know Anne well often remark on the calm authority she carries into situations that might unsettle others. She rarely raises her voice, rarely indulges in theatrical displays of disagreement. Instead, she relies on clarity. When Anne speaks, the meaning is rarely ambiguous. Camilla approached with a polite greeting, acknowledging Anne with the formal courtesy expected between senior members of the royal family. The exchange that followed began in much the same tone as the letters that had preceded it. Camilla explained once again that she hoped to review selected materials within the archive as part of a broader effort to preserve and eventually interpret Queen Elizabeth's legacy for future generations. Anne listened without interruption. When Camilla finished speaking, Anne responded in a voice that was calm but unmistakably firm. She explained that the archive remained under the specific custodial directives established by the late Queen. Those directives required that any request for access be evaluated according to Elizabeth's stated intentions for the collection. The purpose of the archive, Anne reminded her, had always been preservation rather than interpretation. Camilla, by all accounts, remained courteous but persistent. She pointed out that the monarchy itself was entering a period of historical transition. With Elizabeth gone and Charles now king, the world would naturally want to understand the legacy of the longest reign in British history. Access to certain materials, she suggested, could help ensure that the Queen's achievements were properly documented. Anne's reply came almost immediately. She explained that the decision was not about whether the Queen's legacy deserved recognition. It was about the nature of the documents themselves. Many of the records inside the archive had been written during moments of private reflection, moments when Elizabeth had expressed thoughts that were never intended for public interpretation. To expose those reflections prematurely would violate the very principle upon which the archive had been built. The conversation remained quiet, almost restrained. Yet, beneath the polite language, the disagreement was unmistakable. Camilla took a small step toward the door, as if the physical proximity to the archive might itself carry symbolic weight. She reminded Anne that, as Queen Consort, she shared responsibility for representing the monarchy's historical continuity. Understanding the materials preserved by Elizabeth, she suggested, could only strengthen that responsibility. It was at that moment that Anne spoke the sentence that would later circulate through palace corridors with astonishing speed. "You don't belong here." The words were not delivered with anger. There was no raised voice, no dramatic gesture. Anne spoke them with the same measured tone she had used throughout the conversation. But the meaning was unmistakable. The statement was not simply about the physical space behind the door. It was about authority. Camilla paused. For several seconds, the corridor fell completely silent. The historian standing behind Camilla looked down at the folder in his hands, unsure whether to remain or step away. The palace aide shifted slightly, aware that he was witnessing an exchange that would likely be discussed for years within royal circles. The instructions Elizabeth left behind. The confrontation in the Windsor corridor might have appeared sudden to anyone hearing about it later. A queen turned away from a door. A princess standing guard over a room filled with documents that few people had ever seen. But inside the royal household, the moment had not emerged from nowhere. It had been set in motion years earlier by instructions Queen Elizabeth II had written with extraordinary care. Those instructions existed in a document that very few people had read in full. In the late 2010s, as Elizabeth entered the final phase of her reign, she began reviewing the long-term future of several personal collections that had accumulated across decades of monarchy. Among those collections, the private archive at Windsor stood apart. It contained materials that had never been processed by the royal archives, never catalogued by historians, and never prepared for public interpretation. Elizabeth understood that once she was gone, curiosity about those documents would grow rapidly. The directive she created was therefore designed to answer a question that had not yet been asked. Who decides when history becomes public? According to individuals familiar with the document, the directive was written sometime around 2020. It was not part of Elizabeth's formal will and did not pass through the same legal channels that govern the transfer of royal estates or financial assets. Instead, it functioned as a custodial charter. Its purpose was to define how the materials inside the archive should be treated after her death. The opening pages of the directive established the central principle that guided the entire document. Elizabeth wrote that the private archive had been assembled as a record of personal reflection rather than institutional history. In other words, it was not intended to serve the same role as official state papers or historical records preserved for scholars. The documents had been created for memory, not publication. Documents connected to the departure of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex from royal duties in 2020 formed another sensitive portion of the archive. The internal deliberations that followed that decision had generated extensive private communication between family members and senior advisors. Elizabeth had reportedly preserved those exchanges because she believed future generations might need to understand the complexity of that moment. Then there were the records related to the scandal involving Prince Andrew. According to several individuals familiar with the archive, Elizabeth recorded a series of private reflections during the years when Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein became an international controversy. Those reflections were not written as statements for the public. They were the personal thoughts of a monarch confronting a crisis that threatened the credibility of the institution she had spent a lifetime protecting. The directive addressed those materials with particular caution. Elizabeth specified that documents connected to living individuals should remain sealed until circumstances made their release both historically appropriate and institutionally responsible. In practice, that meant access would be extremely limited for many years. But the most striking element of the directive was the question of authority. Instead of transferring control of the archive directly to the monarch, Elizabeth created a custodial system designed to prevent exactly the kind of situation that had unfolded in the Windsor corridor. She wrote that the archive should remain under the guardianship of individuals capable of exercising restraint, even when curiosity or political pressure encouraged disclosure. Princess Anne was named as the primary custodian. The choice reflected a lifetime of trust between mother and daughter. Anne had worked closely with Elizabeth on administrative matters for decades and had long been known inside the palace as someone who valued discipline over spectacle. Her role in overseeing the archive was not ceremonial. She was expected to interpret Elizabeth's instructions and decide when, if ever, access should be granted. Prince William was also mentioned in the directive, though in a more limited capacity. Elizabeth believed that as a future king, William should eventually understand the historical context preserved within the archive. But that access, she wrote, should occur gradually, and only when he had assumed greater institutional responsibility. Two senior archivists, who had served the royal household for many years, were assigned to manage the physical preservation of the materials. Their role was technical rather than political. They would ensure that documents were properly stored, cataloged internally, and protected from deterioration. But decisions about access would always rest with the custodians. Elizabeth had lived through those years with extraordinary discretion. What she had written privately about them remained unknown. That uncertainty only intensified the significance of Anne's refusal. Because if the archive contained reflections about the most sensitive chapters of modern royal history, the person controlling access to those pages held something extremely valuable, not power over the monarchy, but power over its memory. The power struggle no one expected. Inside Buckingham Palace, very few moments unfold entirely in private. Even when a conversation takes place in a quiet corridor, the ripple it creates moves quickly through the institution. The confrontation between Princess Anne and Queen Camilla at Windsor Castle was no exception. Within a matter of days, the story had traveled through the discreet network of aides, archivists, and senior household staff who formed the invisible backbone of royal operations. What surprised many of them was not that the archive had been protected. Elizabeth's instructions had made that outcome almost inevitable. The real surprise was the symbolic meaning of what had happened. For the first time since Queen Elizabeth II's death in September of 2022, the boundaries of authority inside the royal household had been tested so openly. And the person enforcing those boundaries was not the monarch, it was Princess Anne. From a strictly constitutional perspective, the hierarchy of the royal family appears straightforward. King Charles III sits at the top of the institution. His wife, Queen Camilla, carries the title of Queen Consort and shares in many of the ceremonial responsibilities attached to the crown. Other members of the royal family operate within that framework, supporting the monarchy through public service and charitable work. But the reality inside royal households has always been more complicated. Over centuries, power within the monarchy has often depended less on titles than on trust. Certain individuals become guardians of specific traditions, collections, or responsibilities simply because they have demonstrated reliability over long periods of time. Queen Elizabeth understood that dynamic better than anyone. Her decision to place the private archive under Anne's custodianship was not about hierarchy. It was about confidence. Anne had earned that confidence across decades of service. Unlike many members of the royal family, she had rarely been drawn into public controversies. She maintained one of the busiest working schedules of any royal, yet she avoided the kind of media attention that often accompanied royal appearances. Inside the palace, staff frequently described her as someone who valued discipline and efficiency above public recognition. Those qualities had made her one of Elizabeth's most dependable allies during the later years of the reign. Now, they had placed her at the center of a situation few observers had anticipated. Because the confrontation at Windsor revealed something that had rarely been discussed openly, the monarchy was entering a generational transition, and that transition was quietly reshaping how authority operated inside the institution. While King Charles remained the reigning monarch, The long-term future of the crown was increasingly tied to the next generation, Prince William. Certain aspects of Elizabeth's legacy would remain guarded by those she had personally chosen to protect them. Titles alone would not override those arrangements. At the same time, the incident revealed how delicate the monarchy's internal balance had become. King Charles was committed to honoring his mother's memory, while also establishing his own approach to the throne. Camilla, now Queen Consort, occupied a position that required her to navigate both public expectations and the sensitivities of royal family history. Anne stood as a bridge between past and future, enforcing a directive written by the monarch whose reign had defined the institution for 70 years. None of those roles were inherently in conflict, yet in the narrow corridor outside the archive room, they had briefly collided. The archive and the future of the monarchy. Step back for a moment and consider what the room at the end of that corridor actually represents. It is not simply a collection of old letters or forgotten notes placed carefully inside labeled boxes. It is a 70-year record of how one monarch experienced the most turbulent decades in modern British history. Inside those cabinets are the quiet reflections of Queen Elizabeth II during moments when the monarchy itself was being questioned, challenged, and sometimes misunderstood. Few institutions in the world possess a memory quite like that. The British monarchy has survived revolutions, wars, abdications, and political upheavals stretching back centuries. Yet its survival has never depended only on public ceremonies or constitutional arrangements. It has depended on continuity, on the careful preservation of lessons learned during previous crises. The archive Elizabeth created at Windsor was her way of ensuring that those lessons would not disappear with her generation. For historians, the existence of such a collection is almost irresistible. Imagine reading the private notes of a monarch who personally met Winston Churchill during the 1950s and later welcomed presidents and prime ministers from every major Western democracy. Imagine discovering the reflections she wrote after the collapse of the Soviet Union, or her thoughts on the transformation of the Commonwealth during the 1980s and 1990s. The archive likely contains impressions formed during meetings that shaped international politics across the late 20th century. But the most sensitive materials are not about global affairs. They are about family. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth had to manage tensions within her own household, while maintaining the stability of an institution watched by millions. The archive almost certainly contains her reflections on the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, the public grief that followed Diana's death in 1997, and the complicated years that followed as the royal family tried to rebuild public trust. Those reflections were written not as political statements, but as private attempts to understand events that were unfolding in real time. In the 21st century, the pressures only intensified. The rise of 24-hour media coverage and social platforms transformed the relationship between the monarchy and the public. Every decision, every appearance, every perceived misstep became part of a global conversation. During the 2010s and early 2020s, the royal family faced some of the most complex public challenges of Elizabeth's reign. The departure of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, the controversy surrounding Prince Andrew, and the broader debate about the monarchy's relevance, all generated moments of internal reflection that Elizabeth recorded carefully. Those records now sit quietly inside Windsor Castle. For the moment, they remain sealed. Princess Anne's decision to block Camilla from entering the archive was therefore not just about one conversation in one corridor. It was about preserving the boundary Elizabeth had drawn between private memory and public narrative. That boundary exists because history, when revealed too quickly, can become distorted by the emotions of the present moment. Elizabeth understood that better than most. She had spent 70 years watching how public interpretation of royal events could shift from decade to decade. Decisions that seemed controversial at the time sometimes appeared wise when viewed through the lens of history. Likewise, actions that once appeared harmless could later acquire meanings no one had anticipated. By preserving her reflections in a sealed archive, Elizabeth ensured that future generations would eventually understand her reign in its full complexity. But not immediately. That patience now defines the future of the archive. For Prince William, the collection will eventually carry particular significance. As heir to the throne, he will one day inherit not just the ceremonial responsibilities of monarchy, but also the institutional memory that sustains it. Elizabeth believed William should eventually understand the private history contained within the archive. But she also believed that such understanding should arrive gradually, as he assumed the responsibilities that shaped her own perspective. That philosophy explains why William was included in the directive alongside Princess Anne. He is not the archive's immediate guardian. That role remains with Anne and the archivists Elizabeth trusted. But he represents the future generation that will one day interpret the documents with the benefit of distance and experience. When that moment arrives, the archive may become one of the most important historical resources connected to the modern monarchy. Until then, the room remains closed. The Windsor Archive is one of those traces. It contains the emotional record of a woman who carried the crown through decades of transformation. It preserves moments of doubt, resilience, and private judgment that the public never witnessed. Most importantly, it reminds the royal family that history is not only what is remembered publicly, it is also what is understood privately. In the years ahead, curiosity about the collection will almost certainly grow. For now, the reinforced door at the end of the Windsor corridor remains closed, just as Elizabeth intended. The documents inside continue to rest in carefully controlled cabinets, preserved by archivists who understand the significance of what they are protecting. Princess Anne remains the guardian of that boundary, ensuring that the promise she made to her mother remains intact. One day the archive will open. When it does, the world will likely gain an unprecedented glimpse into the private mind of the longest reigning monarch in British history. Letters, notes, and reflections that have remained hidden for decades will help historians reconstruct the emotional landscape of Elizabeth's reign. Future generations will read those words and discover how the monarchy navigated some of the most challenging chapters of the modern era. But that day has not yet arrived. Until it does, the room inside Windsor Castle will continue to hold its quiet secret. The stone corridor will remain silent, the reinforced door locked, and the archive preserved exactly as Elizabeth left it. And somewhere inside that room lies the most complete record of a reign that shaped the monarchy for 70 remarkable years. History is waiting behind that door. It is simply waiting for the right moment to be read.